Now, Daniel Hannan, MEP, freedom. We saw, of course, in recent European elections, a certain swing in a certain way and a huge discomfort across Europe about certain things that are happening. But this is the crux here, isn't it? In our debate about tolerating intolerance, where do we draw that line? What is the definition of freedom? What is Britishness?
Well, you tolerate objectionable behaviour up to the point of incitement. You tolerate eccentricity up to the point of madness. You tolerate offensiveness up to the point of harassment. Toleration means you tolerate. It means you tolerate things that you find utterly appalling. What are British values? Well, you said at the beginning, Nicky, today is the 799th anniversary of the signing of Magna Carta. You could do a lot worse than the spare, terse inscription that appears on the Magna Carta memorial in Runnymede. Freedom under law. If you wanted to distill British values into one phrase, and in that phrase is incorporated all the things that through the years made this country a better place to live than the authoritarian alternative.
They're universal.
It implies regular elections, uncensored newspapers, equality between the sexes, jury trials, habeas corpus, free speech, free assembly, free conscience.
So where there is not equality between the sexes, and we have this segregation row, whether it's going on or not, in public places, and people's belief that there should be modesty and there should be some form of separation. We hear that from the authoritarian right-wing group Hizb ut-Tahrir. What should we do in that situation? How do we clamp down on it?
I agree with what Majid said. You tolerate those views. Tolerating those views is not the same as teaching them in school.
Absolutely.
Every child born in this country, wherever his or her parents came from, is the heir to that same birthright that began with the Great Charter 800 years ago. And we cannot allow our own sons and daughters in this country, wherever their parents came from, to be denied their portion of our patrimony as a free society. That is something that should go without saying. Of course, people can have, once they've left school, they can have whatever eccentric opinions they want. But teaching people that they are not just a random collection of individuals born to a different random collection of individuals, but that they are British citizens, that we're bound together regardless of creed, regardless of race, that we have an identity as British subjects, and we're connected one to another, that is something that should go for all our children.
Liberalism with a small L. Yeah. OK. Daniel Hannan.
Being responsible for all of that is just false history. It is true that a measure of our individualist culture can be said to have a Protestant basis, and that's...
Why did you think I was aiming that at you?
No, I don't think it was aimed at me. But
it was, actually.
But when look at the phrase that appears in the Great Charter, the law of the land. Not the King's law, not God's law, but a law that was immanent in the people and the territory. That was the genius of this country. That was our unique achievement, and that's been our greatest export, our supreme contribution to the happiness of mankind. The idea that the law is above the government, the biggest guy in the country doesn't get to tell other people what to do. He is bound by something bigger than him, and that is not a divine book. It's not a prelate or a prince. It's the law inherent in all of us as a common good.
Daniel Hannan.
The single most disturbing thing I've heard this morning, in fact, really the only disturbing thing I've heard this morning, was how, in a conversation about who is and isn't allowed into secular schools, we suddenly got onto the Jews. How on earth did that happen? That's something which, travelling around the world, I've got in other countries, and it's not something I ever expected to hear in a conversation in this country on television. And I really do find that chilling. But I would just say one thing which I do strongly agree with, the point that we're not talking about a faith community. We're talking about bad behaviour by some individuals. I have been elected for 15 years. I have about 150,000 Muslim constituents. A number of them have got themselves elected to things. I have Muslim councillors, Muslim MPs. The new leader of the Conservative group in the European Parliament, Syed Kamal, is a fairly devout, believing Muslim.
Devout?
Yeah, he tries to pray 5 times a day. He keeps the fast. He's done his Hajj.
Right.
You know, but being British, he's very diffident about it. He hates talking about his faith. But in a quiet way, he has done his best to live as a good Muslim. It makes him a better politician, and it makes him a more rounded human being. And the difference between him and Adnan is he's got himself elected to something. And I would say he is much more representative of the majority of British Muslims that I have in my constituency than people who make great television but who haven't taken the trouble to get a mandate in the ballot box for any of their opinions.
Ajmal Mansour.
I stood clear.
Who's preaching hatred? Yeah, I agree. Wait a minute. But we had 400,000 Muslim soldiers who came and fought in this country for our values in the First World War, more in the Second World War. Young men who all came as volunteers, crossing half the world to take up arms for a country on which in most cases they'd never set eyes because they believed that our values were better than the alternative. And they were right. They were fighting for a system that elevates the individual above the state rather than exalting the state above the individual.
Our values.
Our values, yes. Yours and mine because we both live in this country.
Collective values, right? But neoconservative value that we have just...
I don't think it's going to be British. I think we've lost that. It's going to be something else. We can mourn its loss, but to pretend that we can recreate it by speeches...
I think British values are actually remarkably easy to define. They reside in the elevation of the individual above the state and the elevation of the law above the government. In other words, in constitutional freedom. Now, you might say, oh, but those are universal values, though, or at least they're Western values. No. How did they become universal values, right? Imagine that the Second World War had ended differently. Imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There'd have been nothing universal about them then. These were values overwhelmingly developed in the language that you and I are now talking. And they were exported, through... if we're honest about it, through a series of military victories by the English-speaking peoples, and thank God they were. Imagine if those conflicts of the last 100 years had ended differently, and we were living in a system that elevated the state over the individual. There was nothing universal about it.
Rabbi Laura, I did promise Rabbi Laura.